There comes a moment when the pain you once tried to escape begins to speak, and instead of running, you finally listen. Not because it hurts any less, but because something inside you has changed. You are no longer desperate to silence it. You are ready to understand it. What once felt like chaos now carries a pattern. What once felt like punishment now begins to reveal purpose. And in that quiet shift, your entire relationship with suffering transforms. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and begin asking, "What is this trying to show me?" And that question alone is the beginning of evolution. Because pain, when met with curiosity instead of resistance, becomes a doorway rather than a dead end. It starts to expose the places where you abandoned yourself just to survive, the moments you chose attachment over authenticity, the times you said yes when your entire being was screaming no. You begin to see that your pain was never random. It was precise. It was intelligent. It was pointing, again and again, to the parts of you that were unseen, unheard, and unhealed. And for the first time, instead of numbing it, distracting yourself, or blaming the world, you sit with it. Not as a victim, but as someone willing to witness their own truth. This is not comfortable. In fact, it can feel like everything inside you is being dismantled, because the illusions you once relied on, the belief that you had to be perfect to be loved, the idea that your worth depended on others' approval, the habit of shrinking yourself to keep the peace, these illusions begin to crack. And when they crack, they don't do it gently. They do it in a way that forces you to feel everything you once avoided, but this time, you don't turn away. You feel the grief you never allowed yourself to feel. You feel the anger you were taught to suppress. You feel the loneliness that was always there beneath the surface. And instead of labeling these emotions as weaknesses, you begin to recognize them as signals, messages from a deeper part of you that has been waiting patiently for your attention. You realize that your pain has been loyal to you. It never left. Even when you ignored it, it stayed. Even when you tried to bury it, it found ways to rise, not to destroy you, but to bring you back to yourself. And slowly, something remarkable begins to happen. The same experiences that once broke you begin to teach you. The same wounds that once defined you begin to refine you. You start to see that every moment of pain carried information about your boundaries, your needs, your truth. It showed you where you tolerated less than you deserved. It revealed where you were disconnected from your own voice. It exposed the cost of betraying yourself just to belong. And this realization is not gentle. It is confronting, because it asks you to take responsibility, not for what happened to you, but for how you choose to respond to it now. It asks you to stop waiting for others to change and start honoring what you feel. It asks you to stop abandoning yourself in the hope of being accepted and instead risk being fully seen. This is where the real shift happens. Pain stops being something you carry as a burden and becomes something you carry as wisdom. Not the kind of wisdom that comes from books or advice, but the kind that is earned through experience, through honesty, through the courage to face yourself without illusion. You begin to notice that triggers no longer feel like attacks. They feel like invitations. Invitations to look deeper, to understand what part of you is still hurting, still reactive, still seeking validation. And instead of reacting blindly, you pause, you breathe, you listen. And in that pause, you reclaim your power, because you are no longer controlled by unconscious patterns. You are no longer repeating the same cycles without awareness. You are present, you are aware, you are choosing. This doesn't mean the pain disappears. It means it transforms. It becomes quieter, not because it's gone, but because it's been heard. It becomes lighter, not because it's insignificant, but because it's no longer resisted. It becomes meaningful, not because you forced meaning onto it, but because you allowed it to reveal its own truth. You start to trust yourself in a way you never did before. Not because you have all the answers, but because you know you can sit with the questions. You know you can face discomfort without collapsing. You know you can feel deeply without losing yourself. And this trust changes everything. You no longer chase distractions to avoid your inner world. You no longer seek constant validation to feel worthy. You no longer define yourself by what happened to you. Instead, you begin to define yourself by how deeply you are willing to understand it. This is the quiet power of an evolving soul. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't seek attention. It moves inward into the depths where real change happens. It asks difficult questions. It sits with uncomfortable truths. It chooses growth over comfort again and again. And as you continue on this path, you begin to notice something profound. The pain that once isolated you now connects you. It gives you empathy. It gives you depth. It allows you to see others not as threats or obstacles, but as human beings carrying their own unseen wounds. You stop judging so quickly. You start understanding more deeply because you've been there. You've felt the confusion, the hurt, the longing. You've faced the parts of yourself that were easier to ignore. And in doing so, you've developed a kind of compassion that cannot be taught. It can only be lived. This is how pain becomes purpose, not in a dramatic, external way, but in a quiet, internal transformation, in the way you speak to yourself, in the way you show up in your relationships, in the way you honor your own truth, even when it's inconvenient. You begin to see that your pain was never the enemy. It was the guide. It was the force that refused to let you stay disconnected, the part of you that insisted on growth even when you resisted it. And now, instead of fearing it, you respect it. You understand that every wave of discomfort carries the potential for deeper awareness. You understand that every emotional reaction holds a clue to something unresolved. You understand that your inner world is not something to escape from, but something to engage with. This is not an easy path. It requires honesty. It requires patience. It requires the willingness to feel what you once avoided. But it also offers something nothing else can give you. A sense of wholeness that doesn't depend on external circumstances, a connection to yourself that cannot be broken by rejection or failure, a depth of understanding that turns even your darkest moments into sources of insight. And in this space, you are no longer defined by your pain, you are transformed by it. There comes a moment when the person you once were no longer fits, and it doesn't happen loudly, it happens in silence, in the subtle discomfort of being in your own life, and realizing something feels off even when everything looks fine from the outside. The roles you played so well begin to feel like costumes. The identity you built to survive starts to feel like a cage, and you can't quite explain it to anyone because on paper, nothing is wrong, but inside, everything is shifting. You begin to notice that the things that once defined you no longer feel true. The way you used to please people now feels exhausting. The way you used to stay quiet now feels like a betrayal. The way you used to shrink yourself just to belong now feels unbearable. And this awareness doesn't come with clarity at first. It comes with confusion, with guilt, with a quiet fear that maybe you are losing yourself, when in reality you are finally finding yourself. You start to see that who you became was not entirely a choice. It was a response to your environment, to your upbringing, to the emotional conditions you had to navigate just to feel safe, just to feel accepted, just to feel like you belonged somewhere. You adapted in ways that made sense at the time. You became who you needed to be to survive. And there is no shame in that, but there comes a point where survival is no longer enough, and what once protected you now begins to limit you. You feel it in your body before you understand it in your mind. A tension when you say yes, but mean no. A heaviness when you agree to things that drain you. A quiet resentment when you continue to play roles that no longer reflect your truth. And the more you ignore it, the louder it becomes. Not as a punishment, but as a signal that something within you is asking for change. You begin to question patterns you once followed without thinking. Why do you keep overextending yourself for people who don't meet you halfway? Why do you tolerate behavior that goes against your values? Why do you keep seeking validation from those who cannot truly see you? These questions are uncomfortable because they challenge the very foundation of who you believed yourself to be, but they are necessary because they open the door to something more authentic. There is grief in this process, and it is deeper than you expect. Not just grief for what you experienced, but grief for the version of you who had to become someone else just to get through it. You start to see how much of yourself you put aside, how many parts of you silenced, how often you chose connection over authenticity because the fear of rejection felt heavier than the cost of losing yourself. And as this awareness grows, you can no longer go back to being unconscious. You can no longer pretend not to see what you now understand. The things you once tolerated now feel intolerable. The dynamics you once accepted now feel misaligned. The identity you once carried now feels too small for who you are becoming. This is where the discomfort intensifies because outgrowing who you once had to be means stepping into the unknown. It means letting go of familiarity, even when that familiarity was painful. It means facing the reality that not everyone will understand your change, that some people will prefer the version of you that was easier to control, easier to predict, easier to fit into their expectations. You begin to feel the tension between who you were and who you are becoming. One part of you wants to stay the same because it feels safe, because it knows how to navigate the world in that form, because it has learned how to avoid conflict and maintain connection. But another part of you refuses to stay small, refuses to keep betraying itself, refuses to keep living in a way that no longer feels true. And this inner conflict is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is a sign that something real is happening. Growth is not a clean transition. It is messy. It is uncertain. It is filled with moments where you question yourself, where you doubt your decisions, where you wonder if it would be easier to just go back to who you were before. But something inside you won't let you, because once you become aware of your truth, it becomes impossible to ignore it. You start to speak differently. You start to set boundaries you once avoided. You start to choose yourself in ways that feel unfamiliar but necessary. And each of these choices, no matter how small, begins to reshape your identity from the inside out. You realize that you are not losing yourself. You are shedding what was never truly you. You are releasing the layers that were built out of fear, out of necessity, out of a need to adapt to circumstances that no longer define you. And as these layers fall away, what remains is something more honest, more grounded, more aligned with who you are at your core. This process is not about becoming someone new. It is about returning to what was always there beneath the conditioning. The parts of you that were once hidden begin to surface. Your voice becomes clearer. Your needs become more visible. Your sense of self becomes stronger, not because you are trying to prove anything, but because you are no longer trying to hide. There is a quiet strength that emerges when you stop performing and start being. It is not loud or attention-seeking. It does not need validation or approval. It simply exists as a grounded presence that knows its own worth. And this strength changes the way you move through the world. You become more selective with your energy. You no longer invest in relationships that require you to abandon yourself. You no longer chase acceptance from those who cannot offer it. You no longer compromise your truth just to maintain a sense of belonging that was never genuine to begin with. And yes, this can feel lonely at times, because you are stepping away from patterns and people that once felt familiar. But this loneliness is different. It is not the loneliness of disconnection. It is the space that allows for something more authentic to enter your life. It is the space where you begin to build connections that are based on truth rather than performance. You start to trust yourself in ways you never did before. You trust your feelings, your instincts, your boundaries. You trust that even if you lose certain connections, you are not losing yourself, and that matters more than anything you leave behind. Outgrowing who you once had to be is not a rejection of your past. It is an integration of it. It is an acknowledgement that every version of you served a purpose, that every adaptation helped you survive, but that you are no longer bound to those versions. You are allowed to change. You are allowed to evolve. You are allowed to choose a different way of being. And in this choice, there is a quiet liberation, a sense that you are no longer living on autopilot, no longer reacting out of old wounds, no longer repeating patterns that keep you stuck. You are present. You are aware. You are engaged with your own life in a way that feels real. This is what it means to evolve. Not to become perfect, not to have everything figured out, but to be willing to let go of what no longer aligns, to face the discomfort of change, to step into the unknown with a sense of trust in yourself. And as you continue on this path, you begin to realize that the person you once had to be was never the destination. It was just the beginning of a journey that is now leading you somewhere far more honest, far more grounded, far more true to who you are becoming. There comes a point where the lies you once told yourself no longer feel harmless. They feel heavy, like something sitting on your chest that you can't ignore anymore. Not the obvious lies, not the ones you say out loud to others, but the quiet ones you repeat internally just to keep your world stable, just to avoid conflict, just to protect the version of yourself that learned how to survive by staying agreeable, by staying small, by staying silent. And something begins to shift. You start noticing the cost of those lies. You feel it when you say, "I'm fine," but your body tightens because it knows you're not. You feel it when you agree to something you don't want, and a quiet resentment begins to grow inside you. You feel it when you laugh along with something that actually hurts you, just to keep the peace. These moments start to accumulate, and what once felt normal begins to feel like a betrayal. You begin to understand that dishonesty isn't just about deception, it's about disconnection. Every time you deny what you feel, every time you minimize your truth, every time you choose comfort over honesty, you move a little further away from yourself. And for a long time, that distance felt necessary. It felt like the only way to maintain relationships, to avoid rejection, to keep life manageable. But now, that distance feels unbearable. You can no longer pretend not to know what you know. You can no longer silence the voice inside you that keeps pointing out the truth. It doesn't shout, it doesn't demand, it simply persists, quietly but firmly, reminding you that something is off, that something is being avoided, that something needs to be acknowledged. And the more you listen, the clearer it becomes. You start to see patterns you once ignored. You recognize how often you shape your words to fit what others want to hear. You notice how quickly you dismiss your own needs to accommodate someone else's. You realize how much of your identity was built around being accepted rather than being real. This awareness is uncomfortable because it challenges the image you have of yourself. You thought you were easygoing, but now you see how much you avoid conflict. You thought you were kind, but now you see how often your kindness was rooted in fear. You thought you were strong, but now you see the ways you abandoned your truth just to keep things stable. And instead of pushing this realization away, you begin to sit with it. You allow yourself to feel the discomfort of seeing things clearly. You allow yourself to acknowledge where you have been inauthentic, not as a form of self-criticism, but as a form of self-honesty. Because this is where change begins, not in pretending to be better, but in being willing to see what is actually there. You start telling yourself the truth in small, quiet ways. You admit when something hurts, even if you don't say it out loud yet. You acknowledge when you feel overwhelmed instead of brushing it off. You recognize when you are pretending, when you are performing, when you are disconnecting from your own experience. And these moments of honesty begin to build something within you, a sense of alignment, a feeling that you are no longer at war with yourself, a quiet integrity that doesn't depend on anyone else's approval. But honesty doesn't stay internal for long. Eventually, it begins to shape how you show up in the world. You start speaking differently, not in a confrontational way, but in a grounded, clear way that reflects what you actually feel. You say no when you mean no. You express discomfort when something doesn't sit right with you. You stop agreeing just to be liked. And this is where things become even more uncomfortable, because not everyone is used to this version of you. Some people will question it, some will resist it, some will try to pull you back into the role you used to play, the version of you that was easier to manage, easier to predict, easier to fit into their expectations. And you feel the pull, the urge to go back, to smooth things over, to make yourself smaller again, just to avoid tension. That urge doesn't disappear overnight. It lingers, it whispers. It reminds you of how safe it once felt to stay quiet. But something in you has changed. You can feel the difference between temporary comfort and long-term self-betrayal. You can sense the cost of going back, and it feels heavier than the discomfort of staying honest. So you choose honesty, even when your voice shakes. You choose honesty, even when it creates distance. You choose honesty, even when it means being misunderstood, because you begin to realize that being misunderstood while being real is less painful than being accepted while being false. And this realization transforms the way you relate to yourself and others. You stop seeking approval at the expense of your truth. You stop trying to control how others perceive you. You stop molding yourself into something that fits, and instead, you allow yourself to be seen as you are, even if that means not everyone stays. This doesn't make you rigid or harsh, it makes you real. Your honesty is not about pushing people away, it's about no longer pushing yourself away. It's about creating relationships that can hold truth, that can handle discomfort, that are built on something deeper than surface-level harmony. And as you continue to practice this honesty, something remarkable happens. Your inner world becomes quieter, not because everything is perfect, but because there is less conflict within you. You are no longer suppressing what you feel, no longer denying your own experience, no longer carrying the weight of unspoken truths. There is a clarity that comes with this, a sense that you know where you stand, a feeling that your actions are aligned with your values, a trust that you can rely on yourself to be real, even when it's difficult. This kind of honesty is not loud, it doesn't need to be dramatic, it doesn't need to prove anything. It exists in the way you make decisions, in the way you respond to situations, in the way you hold yourself with a quiet sense of integrity. You begin to understand that honesty is not just about what you say, it's about how you live. It's about whether your external life reflects your internal truth. It's about whether you are willing to face discomfort in order to stay aligned with yourself. And this alignment becomes your anchor. It grounds you in moments of uncertainty. It guides you when you feel lost. It reminds you that no matter what happens externally, you have not abandoned yourself. This is the deeper shift. You are no longer living to maintain an image. You are no longer driven by the need to be liked. You are no longer willing to sacrifice your truth for the sake of temporary peace. You are living in a way that feels real, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's uncertain, even when it challenges the people and patterns around you. And in this space, something within you becomes unshakable, not because life is easy, but because you are no longer divided within yourself. You are no longer pretending. You are no longer hiding. You are no longer negotiating your truth. You are simply being honest in a way that is raw, grounded, and deeply human, and that honesty becomes the foundation of a life that is not built on illusion, but on something far more solid, far more real, far more aligned with who you truly are. There comes a quiet turning point where your relationships begin to change, not because you force them to, not because you make some dramatic decision to cut people off, but because something inside you is no longer the same, and that internal shift starts to reshape everything around you. It happens subtly at first, almost unnoticed, like a slow drifting apart from dynamics that once felt normal, like a growing distance between who you are becoming and what you used to tolerate. You begin to feel a difference in the way you connect. Conversations that once felt easy now feel surface level. Interactions that once felt comfortable now feel draining. You start to notice how often you were playing a role rather than being real, how often you adjusted your tone, your opinions, your energy, just to maintain a sense of harmony that wasn't actually honest. And this awareness doesn't come with immediate clarity. It comes with a quiet discomfort that you can't fully explain. You find yourself pulling back, not out of rejection, but out of a need for something deeper, something more aligned, something that doesn't require you to leave parts of yourself behind just to stay connected. You begin to recognize patterns that were once invisible to you. You see how certain relationships were built on unspoken agreements, on roles that you unconsciously accepted. Maybe you were the one who always listened but was never heard. Maybe you were the one who always gave but rarely received. Maybe you were the one who kept the peace, who avoided conflict, who carried the emotional weight just to keep things stable. And now, those roles feel heavy. Not because the people around you have changed, but because you have. The way you relate to yourself is shifting, and as that happens, the way you relate to others cannot stay the same. You can no longer ignore what you feel. You can no longer pretend that certain behaviors don't affect you. You can no longer participate in dynamics that require you to disconnect from your own truth. This is where the natural shift begins. You stop over-explaining yourself. You stop chasing people's attention. You stop trying to fix or manage everyone else's emotions, not out of indifference, but out of a deeper understanding that your responsibility is not to control others, but to remain connected to yourself. And this change creates space, space that feels unfamiliar at first, space where certain conversations don't happen anymore, space where certain people don't reach out as often. Space where the constant noise of interaction quiets down, leaving you alone with yourself in a way that can feel both peaceful and unsettling. Because part of you still remembers how things used to be, the familiarity, the routine, the sense of belonging, even if it came at the cost of authenticity. And there may be moments where you question yourself, where you wonder if you are pulling away too much, if you are becoming distant, if you are losing something important. But if you listen closely, you will notice that what you are losing is not connection, it is misalignment. You are no longer willing to stay in spaces where you cannot be real. You are no longer willing to engage in relationships that require you to perform, to shrink, to silence yourself. And this is not a rejection of others, it is a recognition of what you need in order to feel whole. As this shift continues, you start to notice something else. The relationships that remain begin to deepen. Not all of them, but the ones that can hold your truth, the ones that can meet you where you are, the ones that don't require you to be anything other than yourself. These connections may be fewer, but they feel more real, more grounded, more nourishing. You find yourself having conversations that go beyond the surface, where you can speak openly without fear of judgment, where you can express your thoughts and emotions without filtering them to fit someone else's expectations. There is a sense of ease in these interactions, not because everything is perfect, but because there is honesty, there is presence, there is a mutual willingness to see and be seen. At the same time, some relationships begin to fade, not with conflict, not with confrontation, but with a quiet distance that grows over time. The energy you once invested is no longer there. The effort you once made feels unnecessary, and instead of forcing things to stay the same, you allow them to change. This can be one of the most challenging parts of growth. Letting go without resentment, allowing distance without guilt, accepting that not every relationship is meant to evolve with you. You begin to understand that people come into your life for different reasons, and not all of them are meant to stay forever. Some were there to teach you something, to reflect something back to you, to support you at a certain stage of your journey. And as you move beyond that stage, it is natural for those connections to shift. This doesn't mean you stop caring. It doesn't mean you become cold or detached. It means you are no longer holding on to what no longer fits. You are allowing life to reorganize itself around who you are becoming. And in this process, you start to build a different kind of relationship with others. One that is not based on obligation or fear. One that is not driven by the need to be accepted. One that is rooted in authenticity, in mutual respect, and emotional safety. You begin to choose your connections more consciously. You pay attention to how people make you feel, not in a reactive way, but in an aware way. You notice where you feel seen, where you feel heard, where you feel valued for who you are rather than what you provide. And you gravitate toward those spaces, not out of need, but out of alignment. There is a quiet confidence that emerges in this. You are no longer chasing relationships to fill a void. You are no longer tolerating dynamics that drain you. You are no longer afraid of being alone because you have learned how to be with yourself. And this changes everything. Because when you are no longer afraid of losing people, you stop compromising your truth to keep them. When you are no longer dependent on external validation, you stop seeking it in places where it cannot be found. When you are grounded in yourself, your relationships become a reflection of that stability rather than a source of instability. This is not about having perfect relationships. It is about having honest ones. Ones where you can show up as you are. Ones where you can express what you feel. Ones where there is space for growth, for change, for imperfection. And as you continue to evolve, your relationships will continue to shift. Some will deepen, some will fade, some will surprise you, but all of them will reflect where you are in your journey. And instead of resisting this, instead of trying to control it, you begin to trust it. You trust that the right people will meet you where you are. You trust that the connections meant for you will not require you to abandon yourself. You trust that even in moments of distance or loss, you are not moving backward. You are moving closer to something that is more real, more aligned, more true to who you are becoming. And in that trust, your relationships stop being something you hold on to out of fear and become something that flows naturally from the way you live, the way you feel, and the way you choose to stay connected to yourself above all else.